You're lying still now. The candle is flickering just a little beside you. Maybe you've drawn your blanket up to your chin. Maybe the night air smells faintly of earth, or rain, or silence itself. Tonight, we're going back in time, but not to castles or kings or the velvet hush of monasteries. No, we're going to stand in the street, in the dirt, in the cold, with the crowd. We're going to bear witness. You see, for all the chivalric tales and stained glass saints that color our modern picture of the Middle Ages, there's another truth buried just beneath the surface. A truth not written in illuminated manuscripts, but carved into flesh and bone. Public punishment was a performance. It was a ritual, a message, a warning, a deeply human spectacle soaked in humiliation, fear, and the brutal ingenuity of the law. But here's the part they don't tell you in history class. It wasn't just the criminals who suffered. The townspeople did too. The butchers and weavers, the mothers, the wide-eyed children clinging to their father's tunic. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't hidden behind courtrooms or bureaucratic files. It was loud, wet, smelling of sweat and blood, and something ancient that clung to the cobblestones. And worse yet, the line between guilt and innocence was often drawn with chalk, then kicked away by the crowd. So tonight, we won't just talk about punishments. We'll walk among them. We'll lean against a scaffold post beside a gossiping tanner. We'll shiver in the winter mist, watching as a cart rolls in, carrying someone who was, just yesterday, a neighbor. We'll ask, why was shame so sacred? Why did the pillory attract laughter and rotting vegetables? Why did so many punishments need an audience? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what does it say about the people who watched? But don't worry, we'll go slowly. Each punishment, each grotesque little ritual, we'll explore gently. No need to flinch. This isn't a horror show. It's a sleep story, a true one. You'll hear the clink of chains, yes, but only softly. You'll smell the iron tang of the executioner's blade, yes, but only faintly, like a ghost from a memory that never belonged to you. There were gallows and stocks, of course, but also ducking stools and scold's bridles, whipping posts, branding irons, and justice dealt from carts that doubled as traveling theaters of pain. And not all punishments left scars. Some simply left you standing, tied upright in the market square, stripped of dignity instead of skin, left to weather 1,000 stares and a few well-aimed turnips. We'll visit those punishments too, and slowly, softly, we'll begin to understand what it meant to live in a world where justice had a stage, and you could always be dragged onto it. So tuck yourself in. Let the modern world slip a little further away. The soft buzz of electric light fades into the crackle of torches. The walls around you become timbered, damp with centuries of breath and mildew. Outside your window, the night carries with it a procession of iron wheels, muffled sobs, and boots pacing over wet stone. There's no need to look away. We'll take this one step at a time. And if the weight of it ever feels too heavy, just remember, you're only visiting. We'll walk back out before sunrise. Before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Shall we begin? Tonight's story is called The Miserable Truth About Medieval Public Punishments. It began with bread, just a small, rough loaf, barely enough to fill a child's belly. But it was wartime, and there were mouths to feed. She had taken it from the stall while the baker's back was turned, just long enough to vanish down the alley, clutching the stolen warmth like it might save her. It didn't. By sundown, the woman stood in the middle of the square, shackled in the pillory, her arms stretched through worn wooden holes, neck stiff in the grip of punishment. She was only 19. She didn't cry. The crowd came like it always did. A few lingered from church. Others drifted over after market, curiosity piqued by the rhythm of justice. Children tugged their mothers' skirts, wanting to see. Some held rotten fruit, prepared not by malice but by tradition. It wasn't hatred that filled the air. It was ritual. That day, the sun was unusually kind, though the sky itself seemed disinterested. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A cartwheel creaked. A woman selling turnips haggled just steps from the scaffold. as if misery had nothing to do with commerce. And then someone threw the first apple. It hit her shoulder with a dull thud, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to shame. The laughter came gently at first, almost like coughing, but then it grew. A chuckle here, a jeer there. By the time the second fruit struck her side, people had begun to enjoy themselves. They called her names, not because they knew her, but because they had to. The punishment didn't work unless someone watched, unless someone scorned. We loosed her. This wasn't about justice. It was about spectacle, deterrence by degradation. That's the miserable truth. These punishments weren't designed in isolation, offered noble. They needed the crowd, their eyes, their voices, their fear. Without them, the pillory was just wood, the gallows, just rope and timber. And that young woman, hair matted to her brow, cheeks streaked with spit and pulp, she became a symbol, a warning, a lesson to others whose stomachs might twist a little too tightly some night. She stood like that for hours. When they finally released her, no one applauded. No one helped her down. Potajo. She disappeared into a silence that had once been her home, and the crowd drifted away like smoke. By morning, someone else would take her place. That's the part history books tend to gloss over. We remember the laws, the penalties, the so-called justice systems, but we forget the eyes, the crowd, the performance. In medieval Europe, punishment wasn't a private matter. There were no solitary prison cells, no quiet courtrooms sealed by oak-paneled doors. Instead, justice spilled out into the streets like a bad song, tuneless, cruel, and impossible to ignore. You didn't just pay a fine. You were paraded through town in a cart. You weren't just sentenced. You were displayed in stocks at whipping posts, on raised platforms with signs hanging from your neck, spelling out your crime. And the worst part? Most people didn't even think it was strange. For them, this was daily life. Part morality play, part civic obligation, part twisted entertainment. Watching someone get punished was as common as buying bread or gossiping at the well. And the tools of this theater were many. There was the pillory, of course, iconic in every sense, reducing humans to mockery with just a few planks of timber. There was the scold's bridle, an iron muzzle fitted onto the heads of women accused of gossip or backtalk, their tongues pierced by small spikes inside the device. And then there were the whipping posts, placed prominently in town squares, where punishment could be both heard and seen from every nearby window. No act was too small to merit humiliation. No sin too petty for pain. Stealing lace, cheating at dice, speaking out of turn in church, each had its place on the public stage. Even animals weren't safe. Oftudinho fouls. In some regions, pigs were tried for murder. Rats were excommunicated. Justice was more ceremony than substance, and beneath it all ran a river of fear. Because anyone could be next. A slip of the tongue, a loaf of bread, a rumor whispered by the wrong neighbor. And suddenly, you were no longer the onlooker. You were the main act. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world. We'll take our time. We'll explore the architecture of cruelty and the rituals of shame. Why, we'll examine how societies built meaning from punishment and how the echoes of that brutality still linger today in surprising ways. But gently. We won't dwell in the gore. We'll stay in the quiet corners, behind the barrels, and beneath the balconies, observing history unfold like fog in a moonlit square. Because while the punishments were loud, the lessons are quieter. They ask us to look at ourselves, at how we treat those who falter, at what we cheer for, at what we tolerate, just because we've always tolerated it. And as we drift through the stories, some absurd, some horrific, some heartbreakingly mundane, we might find a strange kind of sleepiness in it all, like a lullaby, written by cobblestones and iron hinges. So let's begin. Let's uncover the miserable truth about public punishment in the Middle Ages. Not to gawk, but to understand. Not to relive it, but to remember that history has teeth, and sometimes it smiles when it bites. The pillory sat at the edge of the square, like a bad memory no one could quite forget. It wasn't ornate, just a stout wooden frame, weather-warped and iron-bound, with 3 circular holes worn smooth by repetition. 1 for the neck, 2 for the wrists. You could almost mistake it for a crude piece of furniture, if not for the dark streaks where skin had once met wood. But here's the thing. It wasn't furniture. It was a stage. And in the theater of medieval punishment, the pillory was front row center. It stood where people had to see it, just outside the alehouse, across from the church, next to the bread seller's stall. It was impossible to ignore. You might walk past it carrying grain. You might hear someone groan from within it while buying onions. You might even toss a glance its way while discussing wool prices with a neighbor. The town square was the communal living room of the medieval world. Deals were made there, secrets traded. And justice? Justice was performed there. Imagine you're there now. It's morning. The light is soft but growing brighter by the minute. The cobblestones are still wet with dew and footsteps. A small crowd gathers in its usual way. Not out of urgency, but out of habit. You see the same faces. The innkeeper's son, arms crossed. A washerwoman, basket at her feet. 2 monks pretending not to look, but standing too still to be doing anything else. The bailiff appears with a man in tow, middle-aged, red-eyed, his tunic slightly torn. Maybe he stole something. Maybe he insulted the mayor. Maybe he was just too loud in church. The point is, he's not a monster. He's familiar, human, and soon, he is part of the set. The wood claps shut around his neck and wrists, locking him into stillness. The crowd shifts. A few children giggle. An old woman spits toward his feet. Not close enough to hit, just close enough to matter. He's not screaming. Not yet. That will come later, when his muscles start to burn from holding still, when the insects crawl near his eyes, when the crowd's jeers sting deeper than hunger. But for now, he just stands, on display. Like a sermon with legs. The pillory wasn't designed to hurt you. Not physically, at least. Not in the way a lash or a branding iron might. Wad. No, its cruelty was quieter, slower, and in many ways, more devastating. It was a machine of shame. You were immobilized, yes, but more importantly, you were watched. You were a living message board, a warning sign with a face and a heartbeat. For hours, sometimes even days, you stood exposed, not just to the wind or rain, but to judgment, public, participatory judgment. This was justice, as spectacle, as theater. You didn't just do time, you became a lesson. Alpatab. And the crowd? They were your unwilling audience, and your tormentors rolled into one. Not paid, not trained, just ordinary people given permission to mock. And mock they did. They laughed, they shouted, they threw things, mud, spoiled vegetables, animal waste, occasionally stones, though that was technically discouraged. Technically, the purpose wasn't to maim. The purpose was to humiliate, to turn you into an object of ridicule, so potent that no one else would dare follow in your footsteps, to make your failure so visible, so memorable, that it echoed through every alley and into every whispered warning passed between children and apprentices. And it worked, because humiliation, when curated with care, is powerful. The Middle Ages understood that. They wove it into their justice like thread into cloth. You didn't need prisons with high walls when you could turn someone's face into a cautionary tale. Not every pillory was the same. Some were fixed into stone courtyards. Others were wheeled through villages, making their way from hamlet to hamlet with the accused jolting along like a grotesque puppet. Some were built extra low, forcing the punished to crouch. Others stood high, turning the criminal into a reluctant statue. In London, the pillory at Cornhill had a reputation all its own, used for moneylenders, false witnesses, even printers who published politically inconvenient truths. The higher your social standing, the more public your pillorying. Sometimes, noblemen found themselves in specially cleaned and polished stocks, still humiliating, but with just enough space to suggest, "This is unpleasant, but I'm still not you." Some pillories included signs above the accused, stating their crime in crude lettering or even verse. Others used costumes, dressing the convicted in robes, donkey ears, or painted masks, anything to deepen the shame. And in places like France, The punishment came with an auditory twist. A town crier would read your crime aloud, then repeat it over and over as you stood there. Every repetition chipped away at you like a chisel. Even silence could be weaponized. In small villages where few spoke, the silence of the crowd became its own kind of scream. Everyone saw, no one spoke. The shame fermented quietly. And after your time was done, you weren't exactly free. You were released back into a community that had just witnessed your worst hour. A community that now knew what you had done and how you looked while doing it. The pillory came with no eraser. The pillory was never meant to kill you. But it happened. Sometimes the crowd forgot the line between punishment and violence. Sometimes the officials stepped away too long. Sometimes the wrong word, the wrong crime, the wrong face triggered something ancient in the mob. A fury that pulsed just beneath the surface of village life. It might start with a tomato, then a turnip, then a stone, then 3, and suddenly, someone is bleeding. Once, in 18th century London, a man named John Waller was placed in the pillory for giving false testimony that led to another man's execution. It wasn't a commoner's crime. It was a cruel, calculated one. The crowd remembered. They stoned him to death. There were no official lashings, no gallows, just the judgment of hundreds of eyes, turned into hands, turned into weapons, and the city let it happen. In places like York or Bruges, stories lingered of women who fainted from shame, collapsed from hunger, or died of exposure after a night left bound in rain or frost. It wasn't always violence that killed. It was neglect, deliberate, indifferent neglect. A kind of social murder where no one held the blade, but everyone left it lying out. And then there were the children. You see, public punishment wasn't a lesson reserved for adults. Children watched, listened, learned, some even participated. Throwing things, echoing insults, laughing too loudly at things they didn't yet understand. It was how you taught discipline. It was how you passed on fear. Because if they knew what happened to thieves, cheats, and liars, they might not grow up to be one. But it didn't always work. Sometimes they just grew up afraid. You'd think a punishment this theatrical wouldn't survive long. But the pillory, surprisingly, endured. Long after the swords rusted and the lords died, the pillory stood. Potted furrow, through centuries, through regime changes, through enlightenment and revolution and reform, even as prisons became the modern standard of justice, the pillory lingered like an embarrassing family heirloom no one quite knew how to throw away. In England, the pillory wasn't abolished until 1837. People were still being locked into those wooden yokes in the 1800s when trains were running, novels were printing, and the world was supposedly modernizing. In America, public shaming endured too. Stocks, whipping posts, even scarlet letters. The instinct to punish in public, to shame rather than rehabilitate, proved stubborn. And today? Well, the pillory may be gone, but the theater remains. We don't throw vegetables anymore. We throw headlines, tweets, tabloid spreads. Public shaming has moved from the town square to the comment section, from wooden posts to digital feeds. The performance of justice is still with us. Only the stage has changed. And maybe, just maybe, that's the part we still haven't unlearned. It wasn't the scream that stayed with you. Not really. Screams came easy in the Middle Ages. Childbirth, war, a drunken argument gone too far. No, what lingered in your bones was the sound of leather on skin, that terrible wet thud that broke the air like the crack of judgment itself. The whipping post had no illusions about shame. It wasn't trying to humiliate you. It was trying to hurt you. Openly, visibly, repetitively, a tall wooden pole, sometimes painted black, sometimes left bare, placed where everyone could see it, beside the church, behind the court, in the shadow of the guild hall. The condemned were tied there by the wrists or arms, backs exposed, and then flogged with whips, rods or knotted cords until the sentence, 20 lashes, 50, even 100, was complete. And it wasn't private. People watched. Some came with folded arms and pursed lips, as though it were a sad necessity. Others leaned in with interest. eyes glinting. Children stared too long. Dogs barked. Someone always wept, but no one looked away. Because in towns where walls were low and rumors high, the whipping post was where power made itself known. It was justice as force, pain as punctuation. The whip made a point no sermon could. You didn't need to be a monster to feel the lash. In fact, most of those sentenced to the whipping post were just unlucky. You might be a servant who broke a mug, waddup, a baker who cheated the weight of bread, woman who sold ale without a license, a boy who stole a chicken. Petty crimes, small violations, human things, but punishment was rarely proportionate. Some regions, especially under feudal lords, used whipping for nearly everything short of murder, and even that wasn't always exempt. Sometimes, the post was just a tool of control, a landlord's way to keep his workers obedient, a church's way to remind the flock of sin. Oracle, a magistrate's way to show that the law, though slow, always had a spine. And then there were the repeat offenders, men and women who had been flogged before and bore the scars to prove it. For them, the punishment was often harsher. Harsher not because their crime was worse, but because they had failed to be changed. The lash, after all, wasn't just a sentence. It was a threat, a message wrapped in leather and cruelty. Don't make us do this again. But they did, over and over. Because poverty, addiction, mental illness, none of those things were understood, only punished. The whipping post made no space for grace. The executioner was not always a man in black, with a hood and an axe. More often than not, he was just a man in worn boots, a rope belt around his waist, a pouch of coins from the city council. Sometimes he doubled as the hangman, the torturer, even the town gravedigger. In smaller villages, he might have been the only one willing or forced to do the job no one else wanted. But at the whipping post, his role was very particular. He was the hand of pain, and pain, like anything else, could be administered with precision or with indifference. The best executioners, if such a phrase can exist, knew how to hurt without killing. They knew which parts of the back would bruise but not tear, which whip strokes would scar for a season, and which would cripple for life. They had to know, because too much blood, too deep a lash, and suddenly justice became manslaughter. A botched whipping could spark outrage, or worse, rebellion. And yet, they were rarely praised. Executioners were seen as necessary filth, tolerated but reviled, shunned in markets, denied baptism, their children avoided, their homes built at the edge of town, often near the cemetery, as if proximity to the dead somehow explained their profession. But there was another truth too. Some took pride in their craft, not cruelty, but control, a kind of ritual discipline. The whip had to crack just so. The blood had to bead, not pour. The sentenced had to remain conscious, yet broken. There are records of executioners sharpening their whips with sand or salting them to prevent rot. Some wore gloves. Others worked bare-handed, calloused and calm. Their tools were hung carefully, like a blacksmith's, maintained, respected, feared, and they didn't speak much. Perhaps because the world had already said enough about them. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't explain. They just existed, like the post, like the rope, like the wind after a cry. And when the whipping was done, they cleaned their tools, packed their things, and walked back into the silence of their own shame. They stood in circles, those medieval townsfolk, quiet, mostly, watching, some with arms folded, some with lips tight, eyes flickering between sympathy and something colder. A few leaned in, hungry for the spectacle, but most simply stood still and watched someone else's back become a lesson. Public whipping was never just for the punished. It was for everyone else. A civic demonstration, a morality play, a warning spelled out in sweat and blood and muscle. Every stroke that landed didn't just bruise the flesh. It carved fear into the bones of the onlookers, especially the children. They were brought along, sometimes by hand, sometimes by command. It was a form of social schooling. See what happens, the adults would murmur. See and remember, and they did. Often too well. Later, those same children would mimic the punishments in play, tying each other to fence posts, pretending to whip, shouting accusations in mock trials. They weren't being cruel. They were practicing survival, learning the rules of their world through imitation. And the adults, they watched for different reasons. Some to affirm the law, others to quietly feel their own power, knowing they were not the one tied down, not the one bleeding. A few prayed, others gossiped about what the punished had done, and what they themselves would have done differently if given the rope. But what none of them did, what almost no one ever did, was look away, because looking away meant pretending justice wasn't being served. And in a world where suffering was currency, you couldn't afford to appear indifferent to the law. So they stared, eyes open, mouths closed, and somewhere deep inside, every lash tightened a knot of fear. Because justice didn't need to come for you to change you. It only needed to show you what it looked like. The body remembers, long after the crowd dispersed, long after the post stood empty, and the square returned to its daily rhythms. The scars remained, silent, faint, raised like old script on parchment, a living record of judgment. Some people bore only one, a little more, a set of lashes across the shoulder blades, perhaps, a reminder of a single mistake, a bad year, a desperate act. Others carried layers. And in the Middle Ages, scars were not seen as private wounds. They were public text. Your back became part of your reputation, a silent confession that followed you from village to village. Shirts didn't always cover them. Baths didn't wash them away. And no priest could absolve the inkless memory that a whip left behind. Some lived with those scars in silence, eyes lowered, hands folded in humility or shame. Others hardened. They showed their scars, like armor, as if to say, "Yes, I survived the lash. What else do you have?" But even if the skin healed, the world didn't forget. You were marked. Not just as someone who had suffered, but as someone who had been caught. And in towns where reputations passed faster than bread, that mark could cost you work, shelter, even marriage. And for women, the scars carried a double weight. To be whipped publicly was not only painful, it was scandalous. It hinted at impropriety, at sin, at rebellion. A woman with lashes on her back might never marry, might never enter a convent, might never again be spoken of with respect. She became a whisper, a warning, and a wall between herself and the world. Not all punishments were solemn. Not all justice felt like mourning. Sometimes, the whipping post became something else. A show. Market days were the most theatrical. The square already full, the stalls set up, the air thick with spices and sweat. Then, the drum would sound. The crowd would part, and from the edge of the street came the condemned, roped and ready. People didn't rush to watch, but they didn't walk away either. The atmosphere shifted. Buyers paused their bargaining. Bakers leaned against their doors. Children climbed barrels for a better view. Laughter might echo from the alehouse, blending strangely with the tension in the square. And then, the lashes began. It wasn't only about punishment. It was about performance. The crowd watching closely, the executioner's rhythm becoming a strange kind of music. The sharp snap of the whip, the flinch of flesh, the intake of breath, a moment choreographed in pain. In some towns, musicians were hired to drown out the cries. In others, jesters or criers announced the sentence with flair, mocking the condemned as they were tied to the post. Behold the baker who stole his neighbor's sack. Perhaps he'll bake better bread when his back is striped. The performance made it easier for the crowd to accept what they were witnessing, easier for the officials to frame the cruelty as a necessary ritual, easier for the punished to disappear behind the role they'd been forced to play. But it also did something else. It numbed the town. The more theatrical the punishment became, the more ordinary it seemed. Pain became predictable, familiar, almost boring, a thing to glance at between errands, a sound to ignore while haggling over onions. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest part. When suffering becomes entertainment, the soul forgets how to grieve. Eventually, the posts began to disappear. Some rotted in place, their splinters peeling away into the mud. Others were quietly dismantled at night, taken down by new magistrates or reformers who no longer saw justice in the crack of leather on skin. In some towns, they were burned in the name of progress. In others, simply repurposed. A whipping post reborn as a fence rail, or firewood, or forgotten beam in a barn. But they left behind shadows, invisible outlines that clung to the square. Places where people still remembered, where a stone felt slightly more worn, or a wall held too much silence. Ghosts of posture, of ritual, of voices that no longer echoed but hadn't quite gone quiet. And the memory remained not just in streets, but in people, in the descendants of those who were punished, in the habits of communities that once gathered to watch, in the laws that still prioritized punishment over compassion. Even centuries later, echoes of the whipping post appear in schools that shame instead of nurture, in prisons built more for suffering than rehabilitation, in systems where visibility becomes vulnerability. We don't tie people to posts anymore, but we still tie them to narratives, to mistakes, to labels, to pasts they cannot peel off their backs. And the worst part, sometimes, we still gather to watch. It looked like a mask. Iron, cold and dark, shaped to fit the face, hinged at the sides, locked at the back. Sometimes it bore grotesque additions, a pig's snout, a devil's horns, a grinning face. But the cruelty wasn't in the ornament. It was in the tongue. Inside the bridle, a small metal plate called the bit, pressed against or beneath the tongue. In some designs it was sharp, in others, spiked. All were meant to punish, not just the mouth, but the words it had spoken. The crime, being loud, opinionated, gossipy, sharp-tongued, a scold, usually a woman. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, was not a punishment of pain alone. It was a punishment of erasure. It didn't just hurt, it silenced. It turned the accused into a thing, a spectacle, a walking admission of impropriety. And that was the point. The bridle didn't lash the body. It aimed directly at identity. Because in many corners of medieval and early modern Europe, a woman's voice was already too loud the moment it disagreed. She wasn't dangerous. She didn't carry a blade. She hadn't stolen silver, or started fires, or challenged the king. What she had done was speak. Too often. Too sharply. Too publicly. Maybe she chastised her husband in the street. Maybe she mocked the reeve's poor judgment at the market. Maybe she simply laughed too loudly when she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she was right, and that was the problem. In a world where a woman's virtue was often tied to her quietness, speech became a kind of rebellion, and the bridle was invented to cage it. The legal term used was common scold. The punishment was handed out under the guise of protecting peace, of curbing disorder, but underneath it all was a much simpler truth. Society was afraid of women who refused to be silent. There were no bridles for gossiping men, no metal tongues for boastful husbands. The bridle was gendered, brutally so, a response not to crime, but to character, to mouthiness, to improper tone, to laughter that lingered too long. And it didn't matter if the accusation was fair. There was no trial in the square, no chance to defend yourself against hearsay. If the townsfolk whispered, and the constable agreed, the punishment began. You were marched through the streets in that grotesque iron mask, eyes cast down, mouth held shut, not by your own will, but by force. Not everyone threw things, not everyone laughed, but no one stopped it. And once the bit had scraped your tongue raw, once the mask had been unlocked and lifted, what remained? A woman who had been taught not just to speak less, but to trust less. They didn't just lock the bridle on, they paraded it. Once the iron was secured, bit pressing down, face wrapped in forged shame, the woman was not left in a corner or cell. She was marched through the streets, sometimes with a rope tied to her waist, sometimes with a man walking ahead, shouting her crimes, sometimes with children trailing behind, laughing nervously, unsure of what was funny and what was frightening. It was called the Walk of Shame, though no one used that name at the time. She might be taken through the market, past the church doors, through muddy alleys where her neighbors lived. She passed familiar windows, heard familiar voices, and for a while she became something unfamiliar, a warning in skirts, a spectacle wrapped in iron. People didn't always cheer. Shame wasn't always joyful. Often, the faces that watched were strained, conflicted, especially the women, because every wife and daughter and grandmother in that town knew they weren't watching a stranger. They were watching a possibility, a version of themselves that spoke too freely, a self they kept buried, a punishment they narrowly avoided only by staying silent one more day. For men, it was reassurance. For women, it was a whisper. Be small. And as she walked, she learned that her feet could carry more than her body. They carried the weight of everyone's expectations. The moment the bridle was removed wasn't always dramatic. There were no trumpets, no words of forgiveness, no return to normalcy. The official would turn the key, loosen the hinge, lift the iron cage off her face with care or with cruelty, depending on his mood. Love will walk away, and she was left there, not quite free, because the iron may have come off her skin, but it didn't leave her completely. Her mouth was often bruised, her tongue swollen or torn. In some cases, permanently scarred. Speaking became difficult, not just physically, but emotionally. Would anyone believe her voice now? Would they want to hear it? Even her own family might flinch. A husband who reported her, a child who watched from a window, a neighbor who didn't speak up in her defense. Trust cracked like pottery, never quite fitting the same way again. There are stories, rare but haunting, of women refusing to speak for weeks after their punishment, not from pain, but from something deeper. A silence that no priest could absolve, a silence that said, I understand now, understand that the world was never asking them to speak less. It was asking them to disappear, and the mask, in its cruel way, made that request beautifully visible. It did not kill. It erased. They laughed. Of course they did. Not always cruelly. Not always confidently. But laughter was part of it, woven into the ritual like thread into a tapestry. When the woman in the bridle walked by, someone always chuckled. Someone made a joke. Someone nudged a friend. Because laughter made it easier to explain what they were seeing. Easier to forget that beneath the iron was a real mouth, a real voice, a real person who had once spoken and was now being silenced in public, like a dog leashed for barking. And some bridles leaned into the spectacle, crafted not only to punish, but to mock, forged with grotesque features, long noses, twisted horns, gaping grins, even bells that jingled with every step. It turned punishment into farce. It turned pain into pantomime. And in doing so, it taught an entire generation of onlookers, especially the young, that a woman's suffering could be funny, that her defiance could be reshaped into comedy, that power, when cloaked in ritual and forged in iron, could make humiliation look like order. But beneath the mask, she wasn't laughing. And long after the crowd dispersed, the memory didn't vanish. It rooted itself in every woman who learned to choose silence over honesty, in every man who learned to celebrate control, dressed up as justice, in every town that taught fear more effectively than it ever taught fairness. And that is the quiet damage, the kind that doesn't scream or scar, but lingers, passed down in dinner table warnings, in sideways glances, in the knowledge that it was safer, sometimes, to say nothing, to nod, to bow, to survive. The bridle didn't disappear all at once. There was no grand decree, no universal moment of awakening when people collectively decided, this is wrong. Like so many instruments of public punishment, it simply faded, outgrown, whispered away. By the 18th and 19th centuries, fewer towns kept one, fewer magistrates handed down the sentence. Enlightenment ideals, shifting legal standards, and evolving views on gender and justice began to take root, slowly, unevenly, but enough to push the mask into storage. Some were thrown into fire. others left to rust in damp cellars beneath town halls. A few were kept, hung on museum walls, placed in glass cases beside descriptions too small to contain their history, called curiosities or tools of discipline, as if those terms could soften the sound of iron locking over a tongue. And yet, even after the bridles vanished, their shadow remained. The silence they enforced lived on, not in iron, but in memory, in cultures that discouraged loud women, in families that punished daughters for being too much, in systems that still reward quiet compliance over questioning. The bridle was gone, but the lesson lingered. A woman's voice, uninvited, could still be seen as a crime. We don't forge iron masks anymore. You won't find a scold's bridle in a courtroom, or a town square, or at the edge of a river path where they once made women walk. But that doesn't mean they've vanished entirely. Today, the silence comes in subtler forms. In the office, where a woman is called too emotional for raising concerns. In the classroom, where a girl is praised for being quiet, but questioned for speaking up. In the comment section, where her opinions are dissected, not for what she says, but for how she says them. The voice is still policed, just no longer with keys and locks. And that's why the bridle matters, not because it's a relic, a la Clee's luff, but because it was a message, one that told generations of women. Your voice is dangerous. Your anger is unseemly. Your laughter is too loud. Your truth, if spoken, will be punished. And even now, centuries later, we are still unlearning that message. Still teaching daughters that their words are not weapons. Still helping sons see that silence is not a virtue unless freely chosen. Still standing at the quiet crossroads of history, trying to decide which voices we listen to, and which ones we shush without meaning to. The bridle is gone, but the silence it carved, that still needs healing. It looked at first like something playful, a wooden chair, lashed to a long beam of timber, balanced over the surface of a shallow pond or river. Sometimes it was built onto a platform with wheels, so it could be rolled through the village streets before arriving at its watery destination. The chair itself had armrests, straps, sometimes a backrest. The carpentry was often rough, but careful, because it needed to hold a body, and it needed to sink. This was the ducking stool, not a tool of death, at least not officially, but a tool of terror, of humiliation, of cold, wet, choking silence. The accused, almost always a woman, was strapped into the chair and lowered into the water, sometimes slowly, sometimes dropped, then raised, then dunked again. It wasn't a single punishment. It was a rhythm, down into darkness, up into air. Cough, sputter, shame, repeat. And the crowd watched from the banks, gathered with folded arms and quiet judgments. Children clung to mothers, men whispered commentary. A dog barked somewhere behind it all, as if even it sensed that this was not a game, because this wasn't about justice. This was about making someone submit. They weren't witches. That's a common confusion, understandable given the imagery. But the ducking stool wasn't used for trials of witchcraft. Those were darker, deadlier spectacles, bonfires, and rope, and tortured confessions. No, this was something else. This was for scolds, for women who were considered loud, quarrelsome, disruptive, women who didn't keep to their place, women whose voices rang too clearly through the walls of their homes and into the ears of the wrong men. Also, women accused of gossip, women accused of arguing in public, women who didn't apologize when told to. The ducking stool was punishment for personality, not action. Waddle back, a public drowning of spirit, not a legal reckoning for crime. There was no blood, no lash, no cell, just cold, and breathlessness, and shame. They were often middle-aged, wives of merchants, widows, midwives, sometimes even well-respected, until they crossed a line that no one could quite explain, but everyone seemed to recognize. And once accused, the path was set. They'd be strapped to the stool, paraded through town, faces flushed, or pale, or blank with numbness, all wag, And when the procession reached the pond or river bank, there was no argument, no refusal. They were dipped, sometimes once, sometimes 5 or 6 times, until their lungs burned, until their shoes filled, until their dignity unraveled like wet cloth. And when it was over, they were let go, sopping, coughing, shivering, but never the same, because this wasn't just punishment. It was purification, or so they said. They gathered like they always did. Some came out of duty, some out of curiosity, some simply followed the sound of the stools' creaking wheels rolling through the town. It was a procession, after all, a village event. People watched from doorways and windows, squinting into the light as the cart passed by. By the time they reached the pond, the crowd had grown. Children sat on fence posts. Bakers leaned on elbows. The blacksmith wiped his hands and came to stand beside his apprentice. Gapini, even the priest, sometimes stood at the back, watching without blessing. There was no fanfare, just the steady ritual. Straps tightened, ropes adjusted, arms folded. The accused woman sat stiff, trying not to meet the gaze of neighbors who yesterday may have shared her bread. And then the stool tilted. Wood groaned. The beam dropped. A splash. Some flinched. Some smiled. Most did nothing at all. And that was the true theater of the ducking stool. Not in the act itself, but in the silence around it. The way the town let it happen. The way no one stepped forward. The way they believed, on some level, that this was order being restored, because to speak out meant aligning with her, and no one wanted to sit in that chair next. So they stayed quiet, watching, judging, and somewhere in that crowd, a young girl learned a lesson she would never unlearn. Don't speak too much. Don't argue. Don't be remembered for the wrong reasons. The ducking stool wasn't just for the punished. It was for the rest of them too. A lesson carved not into flesh, but into fear. They called it cleansing. That was the word whispered between magistrates, murmured in sermons, etched into the records of small towns. To cleanse a woman of her scolding nature, to purge her of the sin of sharp speech, to restore peace by means of cold immersion. But this was no baptism. The ducking stool did not bless. It stripped, it humiliated, it drenched a person in fear, and left them wringing with shame. And the water, it was never warm. Sometimes it came from riverbanks lined with algae, or town ponds thick with summer rot. In winter, the ice was cracked before the sentence could proceed. Frost clung to the stool's iron hinges. Skin turned blue. Breath became steam. The woman strapped in that chair wasn't being cleansed. She was being erased, drowned not in justice, but in symbolism. It was meant to make her small, to wring the protest from her voice, to make her presence forgettable again. And it worked. Afterward, few spoke of her. Ortsleikround, she returned home, if she had one, to a life that had quietly closed its doors. Some moved. Others stopped speaking in public altogether. A few were never quite seen the same again. Not for what they had done, but for what had been done to them. Because the ducking stool left no scars, only damp silence, and the illusion that order had been restored. It wasn't meant to kill. That's what they always said. The ducking stool was meant to discipline, to frighten, to humble, but not to take a life. And yet the water did not always obey the ritual. Sometimes the rope slipped, sometimes the chair jammed, sometimes they left her down too long, distracted by a heckler, or convinced she could endure it, or simply caught up in the rhythm of punishment. And sometimes the water, cold and deep, made its own decision. There are records, scattered and quiet, of women who didn't rise after the second dunk, of limp figures pulled back above the surface, eyes open but unblinking. The officials always called it an accident, a tragedy, an unfortunate overstep in the pursuit of peace. But the result was the same, and worse. Sometimes death didn't come from drowning, but from what came after. Pneumonia, fever, shock. The body, after such violent immersion, could only pretend to recover, and days later, behind closed shutters, A daughter or a wife or a widow would fail to rise from her bed. The ducking stool didn't need blood to kill, just indifference, just water, just time, and when it did, there was no outcry, no reform, no sudden change in law. The stool was used again the following season, oiled, tightened, rolled back into place, because in many towns, a life lost in silence was easier to accept than a voice raised in dissent. The ducking stool is long gone. Its wood has rotted, its iron rusted, its name faded into the footnotes of history. Today, it sits in museums, behind glass, sterile, misunderstood, a curious object, a relic of a crueler time. But the echoes, they remain, because public shame didn't end when the stool was dismantled. It simply changed form, and the water, the cold, disorienting weight of it, still finds new ways to wrap around us. Today, we don't dunk people in rivers, but we do drown them in ridicule. In headlines, in viral moments, in comment threads that stretch for miles. We hold people under the surface of scrutiny until they sputter, until they disappear, until they learn to speak more softly, or not at all. We still punish tone before action. We still mock women for being too much. We still praise silence as grace and label anger as hysteria. The stool may be gone, but the lesson it tried to teach lingers. That dissent is dangerous. That being loud, passionate, persistent, especially as a woman, is reason enough to be humiliated. And somewhere in the crowd we still watch, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with laughter, sometimes just with quiet relief that it's not us in the chair. We like to think we've come a long way. We no longer gather in town squares to watch neighbors bleed. We no longer tie people to posts or lower them into freezing water while others laugh. The pillory has vanished. The bridle has rusted. The ducking stool has sunk into history. But punishment, public, humiliating, ritualistic, never really left us. It simply changed clothes. Because at its heart, medieval justice wasn't just about control, it was about performance, about showing the rest of the world what happened when someone disobeyed. And in that way it survives. In every viral video meant to shame, in every comment meant to wound, in every person who is reduced to their worst mistake and offered up for public scorn, and we watch. Even when we don't mean to, even when we feel uncomfortable or unsure or quietly guilty, we watch, because we are taught that justice must be seen to be believed, that punishment must be visible to matter, that silence is safety and dissent is danger. And maybe that's the cruelest echo of all, because while the stocks are gone, the instinct remains, the reflex to shame, to make an example, to believe that pain can correct what we fear, and that humiliation can reform what we don't understand. But what the Middle Ages never seemed to learn, what we are still perhaps learning slowly, is that punishment without compassion does not bring peace. It brings silence, not the restful kind, the hollow kind, the kind that lingers long after the crowd has gone home, the kind that carries through generations, that whispers between mothers and daughters, that teaches without speaking. So tonight, as the light fades and the world grows still, let yourself breathe a little deeper. You're not in that square. You're not in that chair. You are safe and you are seen, not as a mistake to be punished, but as a person who is still learning, still soft, still sacred. Let the old echoes fade. Let the water still. Let the world be quiet in a gentler way. And may you never need an audience to feel whole again. Good night.